The most advanced submarine of the Second World War never fired a shot in combat. The country that captured it took it out to sea and sank it on purpose. It was not damaged. It was not obsolete. It was, by a wide margin, the largest and most ambitious submarine any nation had built. A vessel longer than a destroyer, with a range that could have carried it around the world and half of the way around again without taking on fuel. And in the spring of 1946, the Navy that had captured it intact studied it for months and photographed every compartment, towed it out into deep water off the Hawaiian island of Oahu and put a torpedo into it and watched it go down. The submarine had a name in the records that built it. It was the I-400, the lead boat of a class the Japanese Navy designated Sen-Toku, a term that meant roughly submarine, special type. There were only a handful of them. They were the secret that the war ended before they could use. This is not, in the end, a story about why Japan built it. The records for that are on the record, and we will come to them. It is a story about why the United States, having won the war and taken the prize, chose to destroy it rather than display it, and what that decision says about what the victors saw inside.
To understand the I-400, it helps to set aside the word submarine, because the word does not prepare you for the scale. The boat was a little over 400 feet long. It displaced, fully submerged, more than 6,000 tons, 3 to 4 times the displacement of a typical fleet submarine of the period. Its pressure hull was not a single tube, but in section, a figure 8 of 2 cylinders welded side by side, a shape no one had built at that size before, adopted to carry a structure that no submarine had ever carried. Running along the top of the deck, forward of the conning tower, was a cylinder of its own, a watertight hangar, roughly 12 feet across and over 100 feet long, sealed against the sea by a heavy hydraulic door. Inside that hangar, folded down to fit, rode aircraft. Not reconnaissance floats, not spotting planes, attack aircraft. Purpose-built bombers that could be rolled out of the hangar on rails, unfolded, fitted to their floats, and flung off the bow by a compressed air catapult, while the rest of the boat lay low in the water. It was, in the most literal sense the term allows, an aircraft carrier that could submerge. And the idea behind it had come, like so much in this war, out of the shock of a single morning in December of 1941.
The thinking that produced the I-400 was, in its origins, almost a mirror image of Pearl Harbor. Japan had opened the war by reaching across the Pacific to strike an enemy fleet at anchor. The lesson its naval planners drew from that opening was not only that the strike had worked, it was that the United States was, by geography, very hard to reach. The American homeland sat behind 2 oceans. Its industry, its cities, its coastline, the things that actually sustained a war, lay thousands of miles beyond the range of any aircraft Japan could put over them. The answer some planners proposed was a submarine that could carry the aircraft to the target itself. A boat that could leave the inland sea, cross any ocean, surface off an enemy coast that believed itself safe, launch its planes against a target deep inside enemy territory, recover them or not, submerge and vanish. A boat with the reach to strike anywhere on the globe and the stealth to do it from nowhere. It was an extraordinarily ambitious idea, and for most of the war, it remained mostly that. An idea, championed by particular officers, resisted by others who thought the resources would be better spent on the boats the fleet actually needed. What turned the idea into steel was the moment the war began to go badly enough that a single, decisive, impossible blow began to look to the men in charge like the only kind worth attempting.
So this is the shape of the story. A navy, reeling from defeats it had not expected so soon, pours scarce steel and scarcer time into the largest submarines ever built, to carry out a single strike against a target on the far side of the world. The target is chosen, and it is audacious. The crews train for it against a model for months. And then, before the boats can sail, before the aircraft can be launched, before a single bomb falls, the war that built them ends. What the crews did in those final days, with the surrender already announced and the enemy fleet already steaming toward them, is part of this story. So is what the Americans did when the boats were handed over. They could have kept them. They had every reason to want them. The I-400 was years ahead of anything in the American or any other fleet. Instead, within a year, they sank them, quietly, in deep water, and said little about why. The question this episode follows is not why Japan built the most advanced submarine of the war. It is what the United States saw inside it that was worth hiding from its own allies. Because the order to destroy these boats was not, in the end, about Japan at all. It was about who would be allowed to look next. We begin with the building of an impossible machine.
The order to build came down from the top of the Navy in the first months of 1942, while the early victories still seemed to confirm everything. The original plan was enormous. The Navy called for a fleet of these underwater carriers. Early proposals spoke of as many as 18 boats, each capable of carrying multiple attack aircraft, ranging the oceans, striking the enemy where he felt safest. It was the kind of order that gets given when a war is going well and the limits have not yet been felt. Bold, expensive, and built on the assumption that the steel and the fuel and the years would all be there when needed. They would not be. As the war turned, the program was cut and cut again. The 18 boats became a handful. But the design itself, the specification for what each boat had to be able to do, was never softened. Each I-400 was required to carry enough fuel to travel more than 30,000 nautical miles without refueling. That is a distance great enough to circle the globe 1.5 times. It was a requirement set so that a single boat could reach any coastline on Earth and return, and it drove every other decision about the design. To carry that much fuel and aircraft and a crew of well over 100, the boat simply had to be enormous. So the engineers built it enormous.
The central problem was the aircraft. A submarine is a tube built to resist crushing pressure from every direction. An aircraft hangar is a large, hollow box that wants to be light. Putting one inside the other on a vessel that had to dive deep and survive the sea had no easy precedent. The solution was the watertight hangar cylinder mounted along the upper hull, itself a small pressure vessel, sealed at the forward end by a massive curved door that had to close against the ocean and hold. The aircraft inside were stored with their wings and tail surfaces folded, packed nose to tail, their floats stowed separately to save room. The whole assembly had to be machined to fine tolerances, because a hangar that leaked under pressure would flood, and a flooded hangar on a submarine is a death sentence. Forward of the hangar door ran the catapult, a compressed air track set into the deck, long enough to fling a loaded float plane into the air from a standing start. The drill the crews trained toward was demanding. Surface the boat, open the hangar, roll the first aircraft out on its cradle, unfold the wings, attach the floats, warm the engine, and fire it off the catapult. And then do it again and again for each aircraft, and get them all airborne in the few exposed moments before an enemy could find a 400-foot submarine sitting on the surface. The best crews, by the end, could ready and launch the aircraft in well under an hour. On paper, faster still.
The aircraft itself was built for this one job and no other.
It was a folding wing float plane, designed from the start to live inside a tube and come out fighting. Its wings rotated and folded back along the fuselage. Its tail folded. Its floats came off entirely. Stripped down, it was compact enough to fit the hangar. Assembled, it was a real attack aircraft, fast for a float plane, with the range to reach a target well inland and the load to do damage when it got there. It could be flown with its floats fitted, which let it return to the boat and be recovered. It could also be flown without them, which gained its speed and range, but left it no way home. A one-way configuration the planners kept in reserve for the kind of mission from which no one was expected to return. The number of these aircraft that were actually completed and ready, as opposed to ordered, is a point on which the records do not fully agree, and we should be careful here. What is clear is that the boats were designed to carry 3 of them each, that the aircraft existed, that crews trained on them, and that by the closing months of the war, a small number of fully operational machines had been delivered to the boats that would carry them. The weapon, in other words, was real. The submarine was real. The aircraft were real. What remained was the question every one of these elements had been built to answer. Where would they be sent?
Building the boats took longer than the planners had hoped, because by the time the keels were laid, the war was already consuming the things the program needed. Steel was short, skilled labor was short. The shipyards on the inland sea were under growing pressure and would soon be under direct attack. Materials that had been promised were diverted to more urgent needs, to the boats and aircraft the fleet was losing faster than it could replace them. A program conceived in the confidence of early 1942 was being completed in the desperation of 1944 and 1945, and the contrast shaped everything about it. The first of the boats was commissioned late in 1944. A second followed. A third, the I-402, was completed so late that it was converted, before it ever sailed on a mission as a flight plane, into an underwater tanker, a fuel carrier. Because by then, the Navy needed fuel more than it needed another carrier it would never get to use. The grand fleet of underwater aircraft carriers had come down to a tiny squadron, assembled at the very end, racing a war that was already lost to find something worth doing. And the something they found, the target the Navy chose for the most ambitious weapon it had ever built, was not in Japan's home waters, and not in the Pacific battle line at all. It was a narrow strip of water on the other side of the world.
The original target of the I-400 program was the Panama Canal. It is worth pausing on how unusual that choice was. By the later years of the war, the fighting was closing in on Japan itself, island by island across the Central Pacific, the home islands themselves under bombing. And yet the Navy proposed to send its newest, most secret submarines, not toward the enemy fleet bearing down on it, but 8,000 miles in the opposite direction, to a strip of engineering in the jungle of Central America. The logic was specific. The Panama Canal was the artery through which the United States moved warships between the Atlantic and the Pacific. A battleship built or repaired on the East Coast could reach the Pacific War in weeks by passing through the canal. The same ship, if the canal were closed, would have to steam all the way around the southern tip of South America, a detour of thousands of miles in many weeks. Close the canal, the thinking went, and you slow the flow of American power into the Pacific at a moment when every week mattered. And the canal had a vulnerability the planners had identified. It is not a simple sea-level ditch. It is a system of locks, great chambers with gates that raise and lower ships over the high ground in the middle. Destroy the right set of gates, and you do not merely block traffic. You drain a lake.
The specific objective was the Gatun Locks on the Atlantic side of the canal. Behind those locks lay Gatun Lake, an artificial body of water held high above sea level, through which ships transited the central section of the canal. The gates of the locks held that water in place.
The planners calculated that if the aircraft from the submarines could destroy the lock gates by torpedo, by bomb, at the moment a transiting ship left them most exposed, the impounded lake would pour out through the breach. The canal would not just be blocked by a sunken ship that could be cleared in days, it would be functionally drained, the damage measured in many months of repair. The mission, as designed, called for the submarines to cross the Pacific, round into the Atlantic approaches, surface off the Caribbean coast of Panama, and launch their small force of attack aircraft against the Gatun locks at dawn. It was, on paper, exactly the kind of strike the entire program had been conceived to deliver. A single, surgical, devastating blow against a target the enemy believed was utterly beyond Japan's reach. How much damage a handful of aircraft could truly have done to a structure of that scale is something historians have debated, and the honest answer is that we do not know, because it was never attempted. What we do know is that the crews were ordered to prepare for it in deadly earnest.
To train for a target none of them had ever seen, the crews trained against a model of it. A scale reproduction of the Gatun locks was prepared, and the air crews rehearsed their attack runs against it again and again. The approach, the angle, the release, the egress, refining the few minutes over the target on which the entire 8,000-mile voyage would turn. They studied the geometry of the gates. They practiced the launch sequence from the boats until the deck drill was second nature. For months, the most secret submarine force in the Japanese Navy bent itself toward the destruction of a set of lock gates in a country most of the crew would never have been able to find on a map a few years earlier. It is one of the strangest images the Pacific War offers. A nation being slowly crushed in its own home waters, pouring its last reserves of engineering genius into a rehearsal for an attack on a canal on the far side of the planet. An attack meant to slow an enemy who was, by then, already at the gates. And it never happened. As the crews drilled against their model, the war they were preparing to influence was ending around them. The American advance reached the home islands. The strategic picture that had made the canal worth attacking dissolved. And the High Command, looking at its tiny squadron of priceless, untested boats, asked a different question. Not how to strike the enemy's distant lifeline, but how to hurt the fleet that was now almost upon them.
So the target changed. The Panama mission was set aside, and a new objective was given to the boats. Closer, more immediate, and reflecting how far the situation had collapsed. The submarines were now to strike the great anchorage at Ulithi Atoll in the Central Pacific, where the American fleet gathered and resupplied between operations. Ulithi by then held a concentration of aircraft carriers and supporting ships of a kind the Japanese Navy could no longer dream of meeting at sea. If the boats could reach it undetected and launch their aircraft against the carriers at anchor, they might, for a moment, strike a blow worth the cost. The operation was given a name, and its character had shifted. This was no longer a precise raid on infrastructure from which the crews might return. By this stage of the war, with the home islands themselves under threat, the plan increasingly took on the shape of a special attack. The aircraft to be flown against the carriers directly, the pilots not expected to come back. The reach that had once been meant to carry the war to the enemy's doorstep was now to be spent in one final lunge at the fleet closing in. The boats sailed for Ulithi in the summer of 1945. They were still at sea, still days from their target, when the order reached them that ended everything. The war was over. Japan had surrendered.
The surrender reached the boats by radio, at sea, in the middle of the mission they had spent the war preparing for. For the crews, the order arrived into a strange and terrible silence. They were the men who had been given the most advanced weapon their Navy had ever produced. They were within reach, finally, of using it. And now, they were told to turn around, disarm, and surrender the boats to the enemy they had been built to destroy. There are accounts, and here the records and the memoirs do not always line up perfectly, so we should hold them loosely, of the hours that followed on board. What is consistently described is a deliberate effort to ensure that nothing of value would fall into American hands intact. The crews are said to have launched their aircraft off the catapults into the empty sea with no pilots, the planes arcing once and falling into the water. Torpedoes were reportedly fired off into open ocean at no target, simply to be rid of them. And the documents? Operational orders, the codes, the technical papers, the logs were burned. It is a haunting picture if the accounts are accurate. The crew of the largest submarine in the world, in the last hours of the war, methodically throwing their weapons into the sea so the enemy could not have them. They were not destroying the boat. They could not. But everything the boat carried that might teach the enemy something, they tried to put beyond reach.
Then they surrendered. In the closing days of August 1945, American forces took possession of the surviving boats of the Sen-Toku class. The encounter is recorded from the American side with a tone that is hard to mistake: surprise, bordering on disbelief at the sheer size of what they had captured. Officers who boarded the I-400 and the I-401 described submarines so large that men accustomed to the American fleet's own boats simply had not imagined a submarine could be built to that scale. The hangar, the catapult, the figure-8 hull, the range. It was, to the men who first walked the decks, a glimpse of a generation of submarine that did not yet exist anywhere in their own navy. The boats were taken under guard and brought, eventually, to Hawaii, to the very waters off which 3.5 years earlier the war had begun. There, American naval engineers went over them in detail. They measured the hull. They studied the hangar mechanism and the catapult. They examined the figure-8 pressure structure and the long-range design. Everything about the boats was documented, because everything about them was, from the American point of view, new. These were not war trophies to be paraded and forgotten. They were, for a navy that understood exactly what it was looking at, a technical intelligence prize of the first order.
To understand what happened next, you have to understand the moment the war ended into. The alliance that had defeated Japan was already, in the autumn of 1945, beginning to come apart. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought on the same side. They would not stay there long. And among the agreements that had bound the wartime allies was a principle that captured enemy equipment of military value could be made available for inspection by the other major powers. The Soviet Union, having declared war on Japan in the last days, was within its claimed rights to ask. And the Soviet Union did ask. It requested access to the captured Japanese submarines, including the Sen-Toku boats, to inspect and study them, as the agreements among the Allies appeared to allow. This is the hinge of the whole story. The United States now held the most advanced submarines in the world. By the letter of the arrangements it had signed, it was obliged to let its soon-to-be rival come and look. And the technology those boats embodied, the range, the underwater aircraft capability, the idea of a submersible that could appear off any coast on Earth and launch a strike, was precisely the kind of technology that, in the hands of a rival with intercontinental ambitions, would be most dangerous. The American Navy did not want the Soviets aboard those boats. The question was how to prevent it without simply refusing.
The answer they arrived at was the one this whole episode has been moving toward. If the boats no longer existed, there would be nothing for the Soviets to inspect. A request to examine a submarine cannot be honored if the submarine is at the bottom of the ocean. And so the decision was made. And the documentary record, while it has its gaps and its debated points, supports the essential shape of it: to destroy the captured Sen-Toku boats rather than allow them to be shared. It was a remarkable conclusion. The United States had captured the finest submarines in the world, intact, undamaged, after studying them at leisure. It did not lack the means to keep them. It did not lack museums or harbors, or the simple option of leaving them afloat as monuments. What it lacked was any willingness to let another power learn what it had learned. The most advanced submarine ever built was going to be destroyed not because it had failed, and not because it was dangerous afloat, but because the knowledge inside it was too valuable to share. In 1946, the order was carried out. The boats that had been built across the world were taken a short distance offshore, into deep water near the islands where the war had begun, and sunk. Not in battle, not by an enemy, by the Navy that had won, to keep a secret from a friend.
The sinkings were done quietly, in the deep water off Oahu, in the first half of 1946. The I-400 was sent down. Its sisters were sent down with it, on separate dates, in the same general waters, taken out under tow, positioned over depths from which nothing was meant to return, and scuttled. A torpedo, in at least one case fired by an American submarine using the captured boat as a target, opened the hull, and the largest submarine the world had ever built slid under and was gone. There was no announcement of any consequence, no ceremony. The boats simply disappeared from the surface of the world, and with them disappeared the most direct evidence of how far Japanese submarine engineering had reached by the end. For decades afterward, the I-400 existed mainly in documents, in the recollections of the men who had built and sailed it, and in a handful of American photographs taken before it went down. The boats themselves lay somewhere on the seabed off Hawaii, their exact resting places unrecorded, or recorded only in files that stayed closed. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of it. A weapon represents more than almost anything a nation makes: its ambition and its skill. To capture the enemy's greatest weapon intact is a kind of triumph. To then take it out to sea and bury it where no one can find it is a different kind of act entirely, closer to concealment than to victory.
And there, the story stayed, on the floor of the Pacific, for the better part of 70 years. Then, in the early 2010s, the wrecks began to be found. In 2013, researchers operating out of the University of Hawaii, working with deep-diving submersibles in the waters off Oahu, located the wreck of the I-400, and, in the same general period, the resting places of the other scuttled boats of the program. They found the hole on the bottom, broken by its sinking, but unmistakable. The great length, the figure-8 section, the remains of the hangar that had carried aircraft across the sea. After nearly 7 decades, the most advanced submarine of the war had been seen again by human eyes. The discovery did something that documents alone could not. It made the scale real. To read that a submarine was 400 feet long is one thing. To see its broken hull stretched across the seabed, dwarfing the submersible that had come to find it, is another. The wreck confirmed what the records had described, and it confirmed something subtler as well. That the boat had been deliberately put there, intact, by the people who had captured it. That this was not the grave of a ship killed in battle, but the hiding place of a secret. The finding of the wreck reopened, for the historians who study these things, the questions the sinking had been meant to close.
Step back, and the shape of the whole thing comes clear.
The I-400 was, by almost any technical measure, the high point of Japanese naval engineering in the war.
and one of the most advanced submarines anyone had built anywhere. It was larger than any submarine that would follow it for years. Its idea, a submersible that could carry aircraft across an ocean and strike from nowhere, would not be truly surpassed until the missile submarines of the nuclear age, machines built on a principle the I-400 had reached toward first, that a submarine's most fearsome weapon need not be the torpedo in its bow, but the strike it can launch from a coast no one is watching. And for all of that, it accomplished nothing in the war it was built for. It fired no torpedo in anger. Its aircraft dropped no bomb on an enemy. The canal it was meant to drain ran on undisturbed. The fleet it was redirected against never saw its planes. As an instrument of the war, the most ambitious submarine ever built was, in the plainest terms, a failure. A weapon completed too late for a war already lost. Its real significance came after. The boat mattered most not for what it did to the enemy, but for what the victor did to it, and for what that revealed. When the most powerful navy on Earth would rather sink the finest submarine in the world than let an ally see inside it, the weapon has told you something true. Not about the war that was ending, about the one that was beginning.
So, return at the end to the question we began with. The question was never why Japan built the I-400. That answer is on the record. Ambition, desperation, and the dream of reaching an enemy who seemed out of reach. The question was what the United States saw inside it that was worth hiding from its own allies. And the answer, in the end, is the simplest one. The Americans saw the future. They saw a submarine that could appear off any coast on Earth and launch a strike from beneath the waves. And they understood, holding it in their hands in 1946, that this was the weapon the next war would be fought with. They had it, and they alone wanted it. So they put it where no one else could reach it. And they said almost nothing. And for 70 years, the deepest secret of the Pacific War lay quietly on the seabed off the islands where that war had begun. The most advanced submarine of the Second World War never fired a shot in combat. The country that captured it took it out to sea and sank it on purpose. Now you know why. Next on Tora Files, the engineer who designed the fighter that ruled the Pacific War in 1941, and who spent the rest of his life insisting his country had asked him to build the wrong weapon. Subscribe. The Pacific War, told from the other side.